So, we're on the record.
All right.
And I guess we'll start with the one question that's been intriguing us both in the House races and in the state Senate races. What difference does your party affiliation make in terms of representing your district and doing what you need to do for your district?
I'll start.
So why don't you say, how that would...
Well, ideally, it shouldn't. People should represent the interests of the people in the district and the principles that they run on, which should be based upon the best interests of the people in the district. So I think we've entered into an era, it's a very partisan area we've entered into. And I hold Steve in some ways responsible because you're the chief campaign operative for the Democratic Party and running for the House of Representatives. It creates a lot of poisoned rhetoric. So when Steve called Republicans racist, and you were upbraided, and I saw Bill O'Reilly chased you around Capitol Hill a little on that. That was not helpful rhetoric. It angered a lot of people on the Republican side. It made a lot of people on the Republican side feel that their congressman was simply using them as a target. So I think we need to roll back the rhetoric. I think we need to try to work with people across the aisle. I worked on immigration the immigration reform effort. I was very proud to work with Democrats and Republicans. And I had Senator Clinton and Senator Kennedy, Congressman Joe Crowley in, and it was, that was a very constructive effort. We came very close to getting immigration reform passed. And ironically, one of the people who sabotaged it was a freshman senator from Illinois at the time named Barack Obama. But we came pretty close to getting it passed.
Sounds like you're running against the president and you're running against Democrats, and you're not really addressing the partisanship in the leadership in the House.
Well, look, it's a two-party system. I mean, and that's a healthy thing because it does hold each party, each to some degree holds the other party to account. And I think that's a healthy phenomenon. I mean, that's been the history of every democratic system in the world. That's certainly any system that has a first past the post district-based election system.
Given the opportunity we're trying to give you, can you sell us on any of the advantages of having a Republican congressman in the majority from your district?
Sure. I mean, I can, as a part of the majority, I can do a lot for the district because I'm part of the majority. I mean, minority member of the legislature, from whatever body, has limited authority, has limited ability to get things passed, and that's the reality. So as a majority member, you work with part of the majority to get initiatives through Congress, through the House of Representatives. So yeah, absolutely.
Many times things have stalled in the House because of the Hastert rule. This notion that a majority of the majority party has to agree on something before the Speaker would put it up for a vote. Do you think that's wise? Do you agree with that?
It would really depend upon, it's issue by issue. Generally, parties like to maintain some discipline. So it's very much, I mean, the Hastert rule is not just, one party in one chamber in one place in Washington. There's a silver rule here in New York, which is very similar to that. The Senate has a very similar rule. Most legislative chambers, the majority party has a similar rule where they're going to control and they'll bottle things up unless the caucus or even more importantly the leadership approve it. I mean, it may even go beyond a Hastert rule here in New York, where things will not get to the floor of the state legislature unless they're. Is it good? No. I mean, I think everything should come up reasonably to a vote. But again, party politics being what they are, there are levels of control. And in the Congress, there is actually quite a bit more freedom by individual legislators than there is here in the state legislature, either for senators or for assemblymen who are in the legislature. And I think that's.
You're looking to go to Washington, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Probably a bad comparison.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, it's never in isolation. I mean, you have to look at it as as part of a democratic practice.
Steve, being a Democrat in a House that it seems unlikely the party will regain control this fall, how can you best deliver for them?
Well, I have. Despite the excessive partisanship that occurs in the House of Representatives. I mean, 2 years ago, the Republican majority tried to shut down the entire federal government over a woman's right to go to Planned Parenthood. Last October, they did shut down the federal government for 16 days over the Affordable Care Act.
Now, despite that, let me give you not rhetoric, but specific examples of where I stood up to my own party and where I delivered because I am in the leadership of the House of Representatives. One is President Obama wanted to raise taxes when the Bush tax cuts expired on everybody but the middle class, he said. And when I asked him, what's the middle class, he said people making below $250,000, saying that $250,000 makes you rich. I was able to go into the White House, into the Oval Office, and tell him that $250,000 may make you rich in some areas of the country, not on Long Island, with the high cost of living we have. We argued, we fought. My position was well known, and I was very critical of him. And at the end of the day, I won for my district. And we got that tax cut continued for the next 10 years up to $450,000 in income, not $250,000. Let me give you some other quick examples. I am very active on the issue of gun safety. There's something called the Undetectable Firearms Act that was about to expire. I went across the aisle, found a very conservative congressman named Howard Coble from North Carolina, and he and I authored the extension to the Undetectable Firearms Act and got that passed. It was the Israel-Coble bill. Sandy Aid. I was able to work my party in leadership, and Peter King partnered with me to work his party so that despite the House Republicans' refusal to pass tens of millions of dollars of aid to Long Island for Sandy relief, we were able to get that done through a full court and bipartisan press. The Israel coal resolution. My counterpart at the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee is a guy named Tom Cole. He's a conservative Republican from Oklahoma. He was the chair of the NRCC. I'm the chair of the DCCC. A bunch of acronyms, but what counts is when Hamas began firing missiles on Israel, unprovoked and unwarranted, I literally went across the aisle, which happened to be the 20 feet that separates my office from Tom Cole's office, and he and I drafted the bipartisan Israel coal resolution that passed the House unanimously. So when I agree with my party, I support them. When I disagree with Republicans on shutdowns and saying that a woman shouldn't get paid the same as a man and stalling on immigration and protecting the special interests instead of growing the middle class, you bet I'm going to criticize them. But when my party is wrong, and when I believe the president is wrong, I use my leadership in order to defend my district first and foremost.
Tell us what is the most pressing need in your district?
The middle class. Look, this is a big district. It goes from Whitestone to Smithtown. And there are some areas that are very wealthy, and there are some areas that are poor, but most of my district is right in the middle. If you are in the middle class, particularly on Long Island, you feel an anxiety, you feel an insecurity, you feel like, the rich are doing really well, and the poor, people have their backs, government has their back, but nobody's really got my back. And so I have relentlessly focused on what we need to do to strengthen and fortify the middle class. It has been a very strong laser focus on what priorities make sense for the middle class. Now you've got, and by the way, Grant's a good guy. I don't think he's a bad guy. I think his ideas on middle class priorities are wrong. Yes, no, you can. Of course you can. Of course you can. Yes. But remember to include the part where I said I think your priorities are wrong.
We'll take part of that.
I'll give you 3 examples. Republicans in the House of Representatives continue to protect corporate tax loopholes that let companies outsource jobs using the tax code to help finance that. I think we ought to eliminate those and instead create incentives for corporations to build infrastructure at home and create jobs here. Number 2, the biggest economic crisis confronting America's middle class is going to be college debt. $1.2 billion in aggregate, trillion, thank you, $1 trillion in aggregate debt. 1.2 trillion, it eclipses credit card debt. Now, I think it's a mistake for us to be giving big oil companies $40 billion every 10 years in subsidies. They're doing fine, they don't need our subsidies. Instead, I want to allow middle class families to refinance that college debt. And third, you want to grow the middle class, final point on this, and priorities, you want to grow the middle class, make sure that women are secure in the workforce. And I believe that a woman should be paid the same as a man for equal work. Republicans have refused to even allow us to vote on that one bill. And that's an example of priorities that I believe are misplaced and priorities that my district desperately needs for their own prosperity.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Priorities of the district. Do you
Look,
disagree?
I think we need to grow the economy in the district, and I think that's the most important thing. We need to create, New York as a whole, but this district in particular, needs to create a more vibrant economy. We need good, high-paying jobs in this district. We need to keep our young people here. Too many people are leaving, and I mean, I see it every single day, with people leaving, planning to leave, planning to move part of their operations, planning to close down what's left of their operations here. It's a recurring problem, and I can, each and every one in this room knows exactly what I'm talking about. It is too expensive to do business here. The United States is losing competitive advantage globally. It's too easy, for larger companies to outsource and move their businesses elsewhere. And look, people, they don't outsource just because it's cheaper labor somewhere else. It's the total business environment. Higher skilled, higher paid work is far more desirable than low skilled, low paid work, no matter what your industry is. But if you're hyper regulated, if you've got an unfriendly business environment, if you've got a hostile tax regime, a high tax regime, I had Governor Rick Perry in the other day, and he held an event for me, and I had him in here because his economic model, which is a model of lower taxes, lower regulation, more business-friendly environment, works.
Lower wages.
Not really anymore, and by the way, nor are the schools in Texas now, for example, just as far as social services, the schools in Texas are now rated higher than the schools in New York, on average.
So tell us what positions of the National Republican Party then that you would vote for or want to see passed in the House that would effectuate the growing the economy?
Well, I'd like to roll back, and Steve talked about his vote for the Obama tax increases, and it's true, and I'll give you credit for
There were tax
fighting.
decreases.
No, they were tax increases.
Okay.
Significant
I
rate
disagree,
increases.
but okay.
And yes, and I'll give Steve some credit for discussing with Obama whether that should be $250,000 or $450,000. But the rest of the bill was all tax increase. Capital gains tax rates increased to 20%, corporate tax rates increased, and individual tax rates increased to 40%. Those are very high tax rates in a very globally competitive world. Our corporate tax rate, for example, is among the highest in the world right now. And we're competing with other countries. Ireland, for example, has a 12% corporate tax rate. And I do a fair amount of work over there. One of the magnets for businesses locating there, they've got a very, very high skilled workforce. They've got a well-educated population, great work ethic. But really, one of the great magnets are the low tax rates, because you can put it all together and you can make for a very, very good business environment. They're also very business friendly. And that's something that we as a country need. It's a lesson that we really taught the rest of the world. Go back 40 years and you had Indira Gandhi and statist bureaucratic socialism in India, and Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, and Mao killing people in China. But so 40 years ago, we had the luxury of being able to experiment with different policies. Today, it's a very competitive world. The world's learned all the lessons that they've looked to our success, and they are following the models that we set up and that we succeeded with. So it's it's actually a lot more critical that we get our policies right now than ever before.
So your agenda would be to cut tax rates, to cut the capital gains tax,
Yeah.
All of the things you've mentioned. So how do you balance the books then? What do you cut in terms of services? The vast majority of the spending, of course, is in Social Security, healthcare, defense, and debt service.
Look, cutting tax rates is not a linear reduction in revenue. They're because of stimulus.
Not linear.
Not linear, but I'm
not
not
gonna
going to give you the Laffer curve. But at the same time, it isn't linear, and there is additional economic activity. So a tax cut of 10% does not result in a revenue loss of 10% if we're talking about rates. So what do? You also attack some of the corruption, and I deem it corruption in the government, which are the constant givebacks and the tax credits that are given to favored industries and substantial donors.
Crony capitalism, no matter
the
where
crony
you find
capitalism.
it.
Yeah, the crony capitalism.
How do you fix that? How do you
Well,
finally get to that? We
Start
always
by
hear
trying to
that.
sweep it. Start by trying to sweep as much of it away and as many of the most egregious cases away as possible. And I have to say, it's actually a real philosophical difference between Steve and I. I mean, Steve has done a series of press conferences this summer, in which he's appeared at different localities, promising a tax credit for one favored group or another. Probably the one I found the most kind of absurd was he proposed a tax credit for people taking private SAT prep classes. And he opposes tuition tax credits or tax deductions for people sending their kids to private schools, but he supports giving people a tax credit to send their kids to private SAT prep classes. And of course, the SAT prep owners, course company owners were there with him for the press conference. But it's absurd. I mean, we should be more interested in educating kids. And again, Steve supported Common Core and supported the imposition of Common Core on the schools, which is part of what's created this general atmosphere of crisis right now. And it isn't real crisis, but.
Via what vote did Steve support that?
He supported it in 2009. He supported the funding for the Common Core.
Funding for Race to the Top, you mean?
I was Race to the Top, yeah.
Okay.
And that's been used as part of the Federal Department of Education's mandates to impose Common Core. And it's imposed. I mean, a lot of school districts would have chosen not to take Common Core.
You're saying the federal government imposed Common Core on the school districts?
It imposed through federal mandates on the states the requirement to adopt Common Core. Now that has been adopted by the states as a consequence.
How many states?
Initially or now?
No.
Because there's been.
So you're saying the federal government mandated it, but not every state did it?
Not every state has done it at this
So
point.
the federal government didn't mandate it? No.
Well, they attached federal money to it, so.
But I want to get back to my initial question for just a minute. You talked about a lot of taxes you'd like to cut, which seems like a pretty big hit.
Mhm.
But I'm not seeing anything that you think government is doing now that they shouldn't be doing that's going to save government in terms of spending.
Well, I think what they should.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't think you'd want to grow a deficit.
No, I mean, look, the deficit's too large already. I think you have to take a look at the federal domain. I mean, I believe in zero-based budgeting. I think you go through the budget, just like any business does, and evaluates every program on the basis of whether it is a proper and appropriate program, it is a good use of the taxpayers' money or not. Am I going to sit here? I haven't sat in Congress for 14 years. I haven't, I'm not being paid. I haven't been paid for, however millions at this point to have done this for the last 14 years. But I do know public policy, and I take it very seriously. And I think you all know that, from my own
Just for
background.
example, in broad strokes, the Paul Ryan budget, would you
Yeah.
support his approach to it?
No, there were elements of the Ryan budget that I did not like, so I wouldn't have supported the Ryan budget. I actually don't think it brought tax cuts that were deep enough. I also don't think that I didn't like some of the cuts that were made, particularly to veterans' benefits, which I thought were not appropriate.
It's
Do
just
I get
interesting, I know it's philosophical, but because you haven't done this job for 4 years, you can't quite outline with certainty where we would cut spending. But you're certain that the Ryan budget needs more tax cuts. You've studied it closely enough to know we should spend a lot less, but you don't seem to know on what.
Well, again, I'm a private citizen right now. So,
I'm just saying that
You
your
know, so-
certainty that we're bringing in way too much money via taxes seems much stronger than your certainty as to where we could stop spending the money we're bringing in.
Well, I see it on the backside. I see it on the end of people paying taxes, and I see
Yeah,
what the impact, and that I see all the time. I mean, I see it with clients. I see it with businesses I'm working with. I do business law. We've set up, new entities. I set up licensing arrangements. We, do a fair amount of international work. I'm actually licensed over in Ireland and England as an attorney. So I do a fair amount of international work, and I do see the pull and the push of favorable policies and the push of unfavorable policies, and how it affects the business decisions of investors and people who want to set up enterprises. And I do see I've seen the craziness of how New York really discourages. And I mean, we've had a wonderful 20 years. In New York, particularly New York City, under Giuliani and Bloomberg, and I don't see that. I don't see those kinds of policies continuing. And many of those policies that those administrations pushed were against a more, an underlying push, a business unfriendly push. I mean, just as an example, I mean, helped set up a microbrewery. It turned out one of the European companies wanted to set up in New York, and we had to deal the nonsense that we had to deal with in dealing with the community boards and the petty extortions and the holdups, and literally millions of dollars that it cost them to set up. That it would not have cost, and they'd set up in 15 other countries that they didn't experience there. They said it was the most unpleasant, most difficult experience in setting up a business that they'd experienced anywhere in the world.
Well, I would just like to respond, if I may, to two things that Grant said. One is on the Ryan budget. Grant, on a number of issues, has had every conceivable position, and sometimes Grant debates Grant. On the Ryan budget, he just told you that he would have voted against the Ryan budget. On August 16, 2012, he wrote an op-ed for Irish Central, where he wrote, "Paul Ryan has shown real courage. Paul Ryan produced a national budget that is balanced and deals with the real problems of huge deficits in healthcare programs, Medicare and Medicaid, that Obama is trying to bankrupt. Paul Ryan will make a great vice president." I'm not quibbling with your belief that Paul Ryan would have made a great vice president. That's your belief. But you can't sit here and say, I would have voted against it, but just a short time ago, write an op-ed praising it.
Well,
Wasn't that written about 4 budgets ago?
This was 2006. This is 2012.
it wasn't Irish. It wasn't Irish Central either. It was in the Irish Echo. But
It was written on August 16th, 2012 from Irish Central.
I thought,
In
I just thought we were talking
2012.
about the recent Ryan budget.
No,
it was actually written in
but
October.
it's very much the same. It has the same principles. Beyond that, on the issue of tax cuts,
But just on that point, I didn't endorse the Ryan budget.
Well,
What I
what does
endorsed
this
was
mean?
Paul Ryan as a candidate for vice president, and I said he submitted a serious budget, and he did. And I'm not going to quibble with the fact that he did submit a serious budget. He tried to deal with the issues. He worked with a lot of Democrats, frankly.
I guess the point that we're driving
Including-
at
but-
is that the entitlement programs are very costly.
They're very costly.
Ryan has, in the 2 budgets that he's proposed, has come up with some people had innovative changes or
Yeah.
ones that would be destructive, depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
Do you support, the way he wants to change the entitlement
Well,
program?
I didn't favor his voucher program and his voucher proposal for the Medicare program. I don't think I don't think that is a constructive avenue. I think direct payments are a better way of dealing of funding medical care than through a voucher system. Because I think particularly when you're dealing with senior citizens, voucher system is one that cries out for fraud and would result in a lot of people, being taken advantage of, particularly our senior citizens.
Did you like the idea of block granting Medicaid?
Block granting Medicaid I do support. I think that's a better way to approach the Medicaid system. To block grant to the states and let the states make their determination on how best to administer the program, yes.
I would like, I
Yeah,
mentioned 2
okay.
things. I would like to respond, and again, you said you didn't like the voucherization of Medicare, and yet you wrote that it deals with Medicare. You didn't say except for voucherization. There were no footnotes in that piece. It is what you believed then, which you may not believe now. However, on the issue of Grant's concern for my belief that the tax code does need to be restructured and reoriented so that it doesn't stack the deck for special interests and big corporations and instead deals and addresses with the needs of the middle class, you bet I do. And so we have a tax code that proactively discriminates against middle class families, particularly in high cost of living areas like ours. And so I do believe that the tax code should be reformed so that if you are living on Long Island and you're taking care of a parent and you're also still taking care of a child, and you try and get a tax credit for your parents' care, it ought to be expanded. That tax credit ought to be expanded so that what you're earning on Long Island makes you eligible for that tax credit, because right now, hardly anybody on Long Island is eligible for that tax credit because of a tax code that discriminates against high salaries in high cost of living areas. Same thing for child care. I believe that we ought to expand the child care tax credit so that more middle class families benefit from it. And on the specific proposal that I made, that we provide for a tax credit for families for college preparation, we have a major crisis in this country in education in terms of kids and families getting priced out of college, being burdened with debt. We ought to do everything possible to make it easier for them. The typical cost for a Long Island family between SATs and GREs and college visits and $65 a pop applications is thousands of dollars. And so I propose some relief to that. Now, I also believe that we have to balance our budgets, absolutely. I'll remind you that in 2009, we had a $1.4 trillion deficit. In 2014, we've gotten it down to about $500 billion. Still $500 billion, too much, but we got it down. You do that by cutting spending, which I voted for in the balanced budget, in the Budget Control Act, nearly $1 billion in spending cuts, some distasteful to me, but you've got to compromise somewhere. And you do it by creating revenues. And you can't argue that we should lower corporate taxes and allow the tax code to continue to reward these huge corporations and not provide tax relief to the middle class, and at the same time say we can balance our budget. It can't be done. You have to do both. Cut spending, bring in revenues, but it's got to be fair to the middle class, and right now it is horrifically unfair to the middle class.
Let me just note to that. It is, it's more important to have, if we don't have an environment in which we are internationally competitive, in which we encourage economic growth, we will not have growth. We will have an economy that is growing slower than other countries in the world. We will see a hemorrhaging of wealth out to other countries, and you're seeing it already to a tremendous degree.
But our economy is not growing slower than other countries at this point.
Sure it is.
No,
Sure
it
it is.
isn't.
It's not growing slower than other developed countries or other highly
It is.
industrialized
I mean,
countries.
Europe has been in economic crisis, and for many of the same reasons, some of them worse. But Europe is in economic, but outside of Western Europe, the rest of the world is growing faster. Eastern Europe is growing faster, Russia's growing faster, India is growing much faster, China's growing much faster, and South America's growing much faster. We could talk about New Zealand, but but I think I've covered most of the world there.
Well, let me ask one quick
Those
question though,
economies are
because
stalled,
it matters politically in the role
Sure.
you're seeking. Why did we recover so much faster than Europe? Was it the stimulative moves of our government and the Fed, or not?
I think we have got, I mean, look, you talk to Paul Krugman, he'll say one thing, you talk to
I'm talking to you, Vic.
Jeffrey Sachs, he'll say something else. But, look, I think that underlying structurally, I think we are better than Europe. So I think we're more competitive, we have a more flexible labor market, or at least have traditionally had a more flexible labor market. We do have generally lower marginal tax rates, although it's becoming less so than Europe, because some of the European countries, and especially as the European Union has grown, there are a lot of lower tax countries that are in the EU system.
But do you think after '08 our economy needed stimulus and it worked?
I think it needed some stimulus. I think there was a lot of money wasted, which is a shame, and a lot of things were rushed through. A lot was rushed through in the stimulus bill. I mean, I would not have supported it in the form that it was proposed and passed. But I do think spending. I mean, look, it's classic Keynesian economics. You do spend. When you have an economic downturn, you spend some funds in order to blunt the depression in the economy.
But Keynes says it's not possible to waste that money, whether he's right or wrong. He says you could just bury it and let people dig it up.
Who was that?
Keynes says
Keynes,
it's not
Keynes,
possible to
yeah.
waste money in that sense. You could just drop it out of
Well,
airplanes.
Well, I think that's the extreme case. But,
Let's move on. Immigration.
Yeah.
Nothing is happening in the House.
Yep.
Steve, is your expectation something will happen in a new session? And if not, do you think the president should take unilateral action?
68 senators in June last year voted for bipartisan immigration reform. Comprehensive and based on compromise. 68 senators, conservative to liberal. They sent that bill over to the House of Representatives. It has been stuck in Speaker Boehner's office every day since then. I guarantee you that if you need 218 votes to pass that bill, there's probably about 230 ready to go. Mostly Democrats, but a good enough number of Republicans that I've talked to personally that will pass that bill. The problem is there's one person who refuses to even let us vote, and that is the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. He won't let us vote because he's afraid of his own base. He won't let us vote because he's afraid of exposing some of those moderate Republicans, the few who are left, to primaries. He said to the President of the United States several months ago, I'll bring this bill to the floor. Let me just get past the primaries so I don't expose my members. Now he's saying, let's just get past the election, and maybe we'll do it in a lame duck. When we get in a lame duck, my guess is he's going to say, let's just do it in the next Congress. And when we get in the next Congress, I expect he'll say, let's just do it after the primaries so that my members don't get exposed. I fully support comprehensive immigration reform. We need to act. We could have acted. The votes are there. Grant can be for it or against it. John Boehner can be for it or against it, but at least let us vote. Just give us the vote, and there's no reason not to other than partisan politics.
Okay,
Look,
great. If you're elected, would you vote?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have a very strong record on this because I actually headed up in 2006 and 2007. I was the national co-chairman of the Irish Lobby for Immigration Reform, which was a bipartisan organization that was put together to support the immigration reform initiatives in 2006 and 2007. Worked closely with the Bush White House. I worked closely with members of Congress of both parties. Steve, you were not part of that effort. I know we had many events on Capitol Hill. Steve was not there. But Congressman Joe Crowley was there, Luis Gutierrez was there, Javier Becerra, all Democrats. Senator Ted Kennedy was there, Senator Hillary Clinton.
How would you vote on the
And
bill?
I worked with all of them on that. I believe in immigration reform. I think we're going to get immigration reform. I don't think we're going to get the Senate bill because I think at this point it is not acceptable to a significant number of Republicans.
Is it acceptable to you?
I would prefer, and I mean, let me see. I'll give you my ideal, and we'll work back from that because you have your ideal, and then you have what you're willing, what compromises are made later. I mean, if no one elected to any legislature, whether it's Congress or anywhere else, is elected as a dictator of the entire body, except maybe Sheldon Silver. It's what I'd like to see is I'd like to see immigration reform passed. I would like to see what I personally support, and by the way, what I think will ultimately pass, because it's not as much what you support, but it's also seeing a way clear to getting it passed. But what I'd like to see passed is what's called a blue card system, which allows for legalization. And I worked with hundreds, thousands of undocumented folks during that immigration effort. What they care about more than anything else is being legalized.
Is getting legalization, not citizenship.
Legalization, not citizenship. And a blue card, what a blue card is essentially an indefinitely renewable residency visa. It's not a green card, but it has other than having a track to citizenship, it's in all ways similar to a green card. It allows people to travel in and out of the country. It was a proposal that was being supported by a number of those in the House of Representatives in 2006 and 2007. There was some talk that it might ultimately have gone there, and I know the folks in the Bush White House were willing to support that. They were willing to support a path to citizenship also. So I think that is a likely path. We're going to see an increased Republican majority, with all due respect, Steve, in the House of Representatives this year. I think that's a very realistic. Nearly every political observer says that. So we're going to see an increased Republican majority.
Is that likely to be a more conservative Republican?
It will. Well, I mean, it's going to be a more conservative House generally because it's going to be a larger
So
Republican
where is
majority.
your
But
path?
but I think that in a couple of ways, right now, and I think Steve talked about the concerns and what Speaker Boehner's concerns were, which was much of his decision making is predicated upon the politics of this year. After this election, it's going to be a much more comfortable majority. Right now, it's a 17-seat majority. After the election, we're likely to be looking at anywhere from 30 to 45-seat majority. What does that mean? I know from talking to Speaker Boehner, from talking to now former Congressman Eric Cantor and leaders on their staff, that the concern was that if something was let out onto the floor to be voted on, that they'd lose control of the process because they don't have a very large majority. I think with a larger majority, there'll be more confidence that they'll have control of the process, and they'll be able to pass an immigration bill, and then be able to reach a compromise with the Senate in order to come up with legislation that will be acceptable. And I think
reality
President.
square with
No,
what
I'm sorry to
the
say.
2006 House was like and what it is now? when he's talking about it back into.
Well, I'm not sure I understand or agree with the gyrations that we just heard. This is very simple. John McCain and Elizabeth Warren voted for comprehensive immigration reform in the Senate, 68 senators. They sent it over. We have said to Speaker Boehner, we will vote on that bill. We can get it passed. We will provide the bulk of the votes. We're not interested in the politics. We're not interested in putting you on the spot. We'll just tell us how many Republicans you can produce, and we'll fill in the blank. We'll fill in the blank. And let's get this passed without regard to the next election or the conference or how big your majority is. People want solutions. They're not interested in parliamentary procedure, process, and partisanship. And what we just heard was parliamentary procedure, process, and partisanship.
Well, with all due
We can
respect,
get this. Well, let me finish, and then
if
I'll
you don't
be
get
quiet.
it passed, you don't get it passed.
Well, but it's ready to pass. It's ready to pass now. Today, the Speaker could call us back, and the votes will be there, guaranteed. I'll sign an affidavit that this bill is ready to pass. It's a solution that shouldn't have taken this long to get done. And to create political excuses or to say, well, we're more concerned with the partisan optics than solving the problem is why Americans are so frustrated with Congress.
I think that's posturing, and frankly, if we want to get something passed, and I've worked on this for 2 years, if we want to get immigration reform passed, you actually have to engineer and work through the system in order
But they
to
did in
get
the
that bill.
Senate, 68 senators.
Is there anything about this bill other than the politics and optics of it, or what about this bill do you not like? Is
Well,
it the path?
I personally don't like the path to citizenship. Would I, if it's the only thing that was being offered, sure, I'd vote for it. But I personally don't like it. But even beyond that, I can tell you, a majority of the Republican caucus does not like that. So you now have a political issue. You now have a, you have to deal with the legislative chamber, and
You have the Hastert rule, which is preventing
by
the
the way,
Yeah,
Supreme
but
Court.
we
There are
get the
people-
politics of it, we're just trying to discern
trying to understand
what
what
you
you
would do
want.
as a
Yes.
congressman.
I'll vote for immigration reform. I worked for immigration reform. I worked for it in 2006 and 2007. I spent a lot of my time. I wasn't paid to do it, but I flew all over the country to do it. And I believe it. I
And
think
would you call Boehner out on this, or would you say, that's just the process?
No, I'll, of course, if I'm a member, I'm going to call Boehner out on it. I'm going to work with Boehner. I'm not going to go in that with an unnecessarily adversarial posture. But sure, I'm going to go and I'm going to try to get this passed. I mean,
Just
that's
so
the point.
I'm clear, a lot of Republicans say that they are in favor of comprehensive immigration
Mhm.
reform, but first we must secure the borders, without being very specific about what that means. You're not taking that position, are you? You're saying. that you would vote
I
for this bill.
believe securing the borders is a part of this, is a
Is part of the bill.
Is part, an integral part of this bill. And if you try to do one without the other, you're not going to get anything passed.
I'm just saying,
So
that
I,
some Republican
and by the way,
senators
and I
that
believe,
must do
and
borders
and-
first,
and I'll be
and
blunt,
only, and then get to the
No, no,
rest.
I think you do it as part of a package. But border security is no joke. I mean, I know a lot of people try to gloss over it. I saw an investigative report the other day where a guy dressed up as Osama bin Laden strolled across the border and then walked 5 miles to the nearest highway in Mexico. And, nobody intercepted him, no one stopped him, no one asked, what are you doing? He literally walked from Mexico across the Rio Grande and then across several miles of Texas into a waiting car on a highway several miles away. There are real issues with border security, and that's not a joke. And frankly, the fact that that is being exposed by local media makes it more likely. And it's all on YouTube. You can sit in the middle of Tikrit today under ISIS control and access that very same video. So that's no joke. So border security is important, and it's important that the particularly porous parts of our border be secured. And part of it is, and again, I was with Governor Rick Perry the other day. He deals with border issues all the time. Part of it isn't building a steel fence everywhere, but it's using technology and using manpower and doing it creatively, and not shutting down border communities so that they're economically strangled, but doing it in a way that's effective, which we're not doing right now. And frankly, there have been redeployments by the Obama administration of border security personnel, which have actually weakened parts of the border because they aren't deploying people out in the field. And part of what I do, I'm a publisher. I have a daily newspaper called the Homeland Security Newswire. My editor is a University of Chicago graduate and former Israeli intelligence officer. So I deal with, we write about this all the time.
Let's move
So
on. Let's
yeah.
put the Middle East on the table. You gave
Sure.
us Osama bin Laden, Tikrit, Homeland Security. Give us your views of what the president is doing in Syria and Iraq. And is that enough? Is it too much? Do you support boots on the ground?
Yeah.
What do you think should be done?
Yeah, I'm very disappointed in what I view as a lack of perspective by the Obama administration when it comes to the Middle East. And again, I've engaged in assisting the foreign policy of the U.S. and worked with the Bush administration.
Tell us, we've gone through a lot of what you've done.
Okay.
And it seems, I'm getting the impression that you're living in the past. Tell us where you're going in the future.
Okay.
That would really be
Sure.
more helpful
Sure.
to us.
Look, I support U.S. intervention against ISIS. I think we should have gone against ISIS earlier when they first emerged back in February and March and conquered most of, at that point, of central and eastern Syria. I think they're a very dangerous phenomenon and should be stopped. On the other hand, there are two civil wars going on right now in both Syria and Iraq. They are ethnic civil wars, which are particularly pernicious. They're ethnic civil wars with each ethnic group having distinct bases of operation and demographic bases. They view, and not unreasonably, all of these groups view these civil wars as an existential threat. If they lose, they will be killed. One of the rebel cries was in Syria, and this was by the moderates that we're now supporting, was Christians to Lebanon, Alawites from the lamppost. There are 2 million Christians in Syria. It's nice that the FSA and some of the jihadis would want to not murder them and just drive them out, not kill them, but it's totally unacceptable that we would be supporting a group that is calling for an anti-Christian jihad.
So where do
ISIS
we
is
go?
far worse. Look, I think we need to sit down with the major powers, and we can't do this unilaterally, but we need to draw sectors and zones in these countries. Vice President Joe Biden proposed exactly that, and he wasn't followed by the Bush administration.
So
I think
partitioning.
wrongly. I think we should partition, whether it's de jure or de facto. We should partition. I think it makes our intervention far more likely to succeed and far more limited, because if those players in the region, with their own armies and with their own air forces and with their own artillery and with their own foreign sponsors, are threatened by our intervention, they will intervene against us, and we will find ourselves in a wider war, and we will not accomplish what we're seeking to do.
And who would enforce the partition? Would we put boots on the ground to do that?
Well, no, look, we already have boots on the ground. We have, according to Obama, we have 800 soldiers on the ground already. So that's boots. But what boots should we be using? We should be using the boots that we've paid for and we've trained for decades. The Egyptian army, the Jordanian army. We pay for the Egyptian army. We've paid tens of billions of dollars to build that army and equip it and put uniforms on those folks. Egypt is now a secular state, largely Sunni, Arab. Intervention should be done primarily locally, but intervention against ISIS should be confined to the Sunni Arab areas of western Iraq and eastern Syria, eastern and central Syria. And part of the instability of those countries, in Syria, and again, I'm looking in the past, but now we're looking really far in the past. I'm going back to Sykes and Picot and their meetings in 1916. Part of the instability of the region is that these colonies, and they were only colonies when they were created, these colonies were fundamentally unstable entities of warring hostile tribes. It would be akin to saying Israel should, the one-state solution, in Israel, which is not a practical solution. Which is Israel and the Palestinian territory should be one territory. It's a recipe for endless conflict. So I think you have to get you have to start by getting the politics right. Then but I do believe that's part and parcel of intervention. But it's taking it seriously and taking the politics seriously. Don't threaten the Russians in Tartus, because they're not going to just ignore that. They have their only Mediterranean naval base in Tartus. So these are realities that this administration seems to be oblivious to.
Well, to the consternation of some in my own party, I lean to the right on these issues. I'm a pretty conservative Democrat on national security and military issues. One of the arguments that I had with the president early on is I believe that we should have armed, vetted, moderate elements of the Syrian rebel movement. I understood the president's argument, which is we did that in Afghanistan, remember? We armed this thing called the Mujahideen, and then they morphed with this thing called the Taliban, and they acquired this thing called Al-Qaeda, and they ended up using our own weapons and financing against us. I understood his argument, but the fact of the matter is we're doing exactly what I thought we should do. We're just doing it late. Here's what I think is going to happen over the next several years, and I think we have a responsibility to be honest with the American people. This ain't going to be easy. And it's going to be operational and sequential. So the first thing we have to do now, which I support, is begin to shrink ISIS space. Or actually, blunt their momentum first. You can't shrink until you blunt their momentum. So one, blunt their momentum. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden they're going to stop. It means that you just decelerate their momentum. Then you begin to shrink their space. And once you have started to limit their space, you begin to contain them. When you contain them, you then degrade them. When they are sufficiently degraded, you dismantle. In my view, this is a 3 to 5 year operation. It's doable under certain circumstances. Number one, you've got to have international allies. And you've got to have boots on the ground. We do not need our boots on the ground. Here I agree with Grant that there are other militaries in the Arab world that can put boots on the ground, and we need to train now forces, and we are training forces, to be able to deal with that threat on the ground. We have, I think the President has done a fairly good job of bringing in some important allies who never overtly supported our missions in the Middle East, so the Saudis, the Jordanians, the UAE, Egyptians, and others. That's part of the coalition, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fast, and we have an obligation to let the American people know that it's going to be hard, but we cannot allow ISIS to continue to spread.
You both seem to agree that the boots that ought to be on the ground are from these Arab countries and the like. I'm curious, do we risk escalating this conflict and turning it into a much more regional conflict by doing that?
I mean, that's part of what I was addressing before, and I actually am a bit more optimistic than Steve. And we can debate some of the tactics side, but I'm fairly optimistic that, with any serious military force intervening, and that means, Egyptian army, it might mean some assistance from the Jordan. I mean, Jordan has a very good army. Egypt has a very good army. I'm less sanguine about the Turkish army because of the imperial history. But, a real army going into ISIS land will destroy ISIS very quickly. I mean, ISIS is only 15,000, moderately trained, mostly volunteers. This is not a real army. They just, what happened, and it's a fascinating phenomenon, which is that the Iraqi army that we set up, that was trained under us, simply collapsed. I mean, these people just ran away. They dropped their guns. There was no serious combat from Mosul to Samarra or Tikrit. That was simply a surrender and flight. I mean, there were no major battles that went on. Most of that was a psychological campaign. And also a total collapse of the Iraqi military for a lot of really tragic reasons, of bad administration, of tremendous corruption, of officers, stealing the money that was due to be paid to the enlisted people in the army. But that was a collapse. I mean, so ISIS is actually, has not had any tremendous, military victories. They're starting to now, or did start to, because they acquired so much weaponry from the Iraqi army. But I think we can roll them back. Short answer, and it's a long way of getting to there. I think they can be rolled back very quickly. I mean, I don't think they have any depth. There's no particular support among the population for ISIS.
Right,
It was a
do you want
vacuum.
to jump in quickly on anything he said?
No, we can go. I disagree. I don't think this is an easy
Going to a larger
exit.
picture about American involvement around the world is, polls seem to be showing that the Americans are more and more disillusioned about intervening anywhere in the world, and saying we have so many problems here, we can't afford to do this. How would you answer a constituent who would come up to you in the town hall and say, no, none of it. It doesn't mean anything to me. They've been killing each other for years. I need help home. I don't want to spend this money.
Well, look, I answer it simply. We are still the leading power in the world. We are still by far militarily the leading power in the world, and economically, at least for the next 2 or 3 years until China surpasses us, we are the leading economic power in the world. And with that comes some responsibility, but there's also an overriding responsibility on the part of the United States government to defend our citizens. And our citizens are being kidnapped and beheaded by this terrorist group. This is not the first time we've dealt with terror organizations. I mean, you go back to the Barbary Pirates and Thomas Jefferson's administration, and they were out kidnapping people and not beheading them as gruesomely or as but they function very much. The terrorist organizations have been with this country really from the beginning, and have challenged us and have threatened our citizens around the world. And just as Thomas Jefferson did in dealing with the Bay of Tripoli and leaders out there, people were acting in terroristic ways towards the United States. We have a responsibility to defend our citizens out around the world.
How would you answer that?
I would, and have, reminded them that there are some deep and profound threats in the world. And although those threats may not affect us existentially today, they do threaten regional stability, which ultimately threatens our stability. And you sometimes have to use hard power. I would also suggest that we need to do a better job of using soft power. And so after World War II, what did the United States do? It didn't just defeat Germany and Japan. We had the Marshall Plan because we realized that societies need institutions, and they need the empowerment of women, and they need functioning economies, and they need schools that are teaching kids not how to blow things up, but how to put things together. And so we have to use hard power when we have no other alternative, but we also have to employ soft power. One other thing on this, I carry around with me something called the NIC report. The National Intelligence Council every 4 years does a report on the world in the year 2030. And I talk about this all over the place. And one of the things it suggests, it's the smartest futurists in the country have to do a report so that we know who we're going to be fighting in the year 2030, because it sometimes takes that long to engineer a weapon system that's battle capable, battle ready. And one of the things this report says is that jihadist terrorism and ideological terrorism may burn out by the year 2030. It's going to be replaced by another form of terrorism, resource terrorism. So we're going to have a 35% increase in demand for food in the world, 40% increase in demand for water, 50% increase in demand for energy, and groups are going to form and recruit to capture those resources and fight over those resources. And we've got to be reforming our military, our doctrines, and our weapon systems to deal with that looming threat. And finally, I don't think we're doing enough about cybersecurity. That's the real threat that we face today. ISIS is not going to invade and conquer America tomorrow, but some criminal enterprise or some group of hackers in Iran, today alone, right before this debate, they were able to hack into financial institutions, and tens of thousands of Americans' financial data were lost. It's going to be against our energy systems. It's likely going to be against our financial services infrastructure. That cyber attack is one of the few things that does keep me up at night. And we've got to do a much better job responding to the likelihood of that attack on our country.
Okay, and how, kind of brings me a little bit into the NSA surveillance. Are we putting too much money and resources and time in gathering all these databases to protect ourselves from more old-fashioned jihadist terrorism, if you will, and not enough into protecting ourselves from cyber?
Yeah, so I think I'm a believer that human nature enters into political decisions. So we get attacked on 9/11, and governmental institutions and members of Congress and the Bush administration and others try and button it up, figure out what went wrong. And one of the things they conclude is lots of people making unsavory phone calls to the bad guys in different areas of the world, so we've got to have some tools. And you know what happened? They overreacted. And they began deploying these technologies and these policies that ended up snaring innocent Americans. And it was an overreaction. The pendulum just went way too far. Now, we've got to bring it back. And I believe that many of the reforms that Congress has enacted have done that. They have provided greater protection for identities. This is a recurring balance. I mean, Grant and I have one thing in common I learned today. We're both lovers of history. And so, the Alien and Sedition Acts, before when we were just founded, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed assuming that there were people in our own midst, who were going to take us over. And there's always been this tug of war in this country's experience between civil liberties and national security. We never find quite the right balance, but it's a constantly shifting pendulum. And finally, I do believe, not to harp on this, I do believe that we have got to do a much better job on information sharing between private enterprises and the federal government to be able to guard against, to detect, and respond to the very real possibility of a cyber attack.
You're just saying, I'm thinking Apple iPhone encryption right now, as you're saying that.
It's,
Yeah.
yeah, if I could just add to it, I mean, I essentially agree with what Steve was saying about cybersecurity. It's a major threat, and we have major vulnerabilities, in part because we don't develop our systems with an eye towards the security, towards long-term security. Simply, a lot of what we produce and a lot of what we function on is done simply to be able to function and simply to be able to get things to market.
But the
And
overreaction
that creates vulnerabilities.
created a climate where no one wants to share it, and I mean, I think
Well-
Twitter just is suing the government as of today, we have the iPhone issue. How do you get that to happen? I mean,
Well-
where are the limits, and should there be a bill that delineates, these
Look-
principles of the civil rights versus the national?
Look, I mean, I think we build it, let me, if I can just, I think you build it off of, look, we have a Fourth Amendment, and it is very, very clear and very specific, and it is very much about the right to privacy. But I think it is very important that we do that. We put barriers up, and, part of it, I think this is part of the worldview of the Obama administration, which I fundamentally disagree with, which is there are two sets of rules. There are a set of rules that apply to U.S. citizens in the United States of America, and then there are a set of rules that apply to the rest of the world. And too often, those rules are conflated one with the other. And I think the end result is we lose a lot of our freedoms because we're simply complying, we're simply trying to adjust how we deal with our citizens to how we deal with, say, terrorists in Afghanistan. And I think that's a shame,
So
because
the Patriot Act should be revisited and
I think
scaled back?
I think the Patriot Act, to the extent it allowed surveillance of U.S. citizens, does need to be dealt with, does need to be addressed. I mean, does that mean that there's no surveillance? No, but I mean, the Supreme Court recently dealt with issues of whether the government can put GPS tracking on, and I think it was the unanimous court that said, of course you can't, and those it shouldn't just be to the Supreme Court. I mean, that sense of propriety and of limits should also infuse the U.S. Congress, and frankly should infuse the administration. And I see it, frankly, I see it as an attorney, as a practicing attorney, I see it all too often that the government takes these powers and abuses them. And that is a shame, because you're seeing what was originally set up to deal with terrorism now being applied to, divorce cases or to a white-collar criminal case. And
Just
it's,
very
So
quickly on
cyber
this.
attacks
This is what
were-
this is what bothers me most significantly, and that is we have these FISA courts, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance courts. Nobody knows who the judges are. Nobody knows what the decisions say. The decisions are now being used to build new bodies of law, but the decisions are secret. So you have new bodies of law that are starting these trajectories based on something that nobody's ever seen. So I have a common sense bill that I've introduced that would reform the FISA courts. You know who appoints the 11 FISA judges? One person. The Chief Judge of the Supreme Court. One person. So my bill says, no, it can't be one person. The President appoints, the Chief Justice appoints, the Speaker appoints, the Minority Leader appoints, so you have at least some ideological diversity in the appointments. That's number one. Number two.
I'm not sure that's entirely constitutional. But
Well,
we can talk
number
about
two,
that
number
off
two,
camera.
okay. Number two, FISA decisions are automatically public. They can be redacted based on a court finding, but those FISA decisions ought to be accessible to people, and particularly when they're being used as the basis for new bodies of law. I've introduced that bill.
I brought up the iPhone a couple of times. What do you think, should the federal government force Apple to allow access to the encryption on the iPhone?
I hate when the federal government forces corporations to invade the privacy of the American people. It shouldn't be forcible. I think you have to have a common sense conversation. You have to bring people to the table and find new technologies, and that's what's affecting this. Is technologies just change so rapidly. Find the technologies that will get us to the right balance between privacy, the right of a corporation to manufacture and develop technologies, and the ability of the government to protect the American people from threat.
Also in that, which we didn't mention, most importantly, is people's right to their own privacy, and not to have their communications and their phone calls and their emails casually intercepted and read and reviewed by government officials. And I mean, that's a fundamental right that we have. It's part of the right to be secure in our home and our property, persons, and effects, which is described, which is what our Bill of Rights says.
One of the things that has not happened is the funding of the highway fund.
Yeah, I guess the larger, first of all, the small issues, what would you do to fund infrastructure work on highways? But on the larger question, how should Congress fund infrastructure work in the country generally?
I mean, look, this is not a new question. This has been, we built an interstate highway system, and that highway system should be maintained, and to the extent population movements want it or warrant it.
But how do you pay for it?
You pay for it out of general revenues. That's how it's been funded traditionally, and you can do a toll road system in certain places, but and set up certain toll authorities. I mean, that's how Robert Moses did it here. But
You would
the
toll
but-
the interstate
no,
highway
I'm not
system?
saying I would, but
Okay.
but bridges are often tolled.
Well,
And,
Would you,
The way
would
it's been
you,
done really is through the gas tax, which has been stuck at, it's like 18.4%, I think it is, since, for the last 20, 30 years. Should we increase it?
No, I don't favor increasing taxes. I don't think we're already paying it. I think that's, we're already heavily taxed.
Should
so
it
I
keep
don't-
up with inflation?
yeah, that's a fair question. You have a tax
Yeah.
that's specifically set to pay for something by Eisenhower, a
Yeah.
Republican,
Mhm.
increased significantly by Reagan, a Republican.
Mhm.
And the reason it increases is the specific cost of the thing it's supposed to pay for
Mhm.
goes up, and the thing that we're taxing on, the gasoline, goes up. Should it go up at the same pace?
Look, I think you have to look at, I don't have the budget here in front of me, so I don't have an answer for you right now. We'll make that, just say, I don't know the answer to that at this point. I have to look to see what the revenue needs are to do the highway construction and to see how the best way to finance it would be. So, I mean, I can sit here and speculate, but, just,
On the taxes.
I
gas
wouldn't
taxes,
support
we do-
increasing the gas tax because I think it disproportionately hits the middle class. The middle class disproportionately consumes gas for their cars.
And runs
If you're-
miles on the roads.
If you're living in New York City and you're in the Upper West Side or the Upper East Side, you don't really worry about that. But if you're living in Melville and you're not worried about the gas tax. If you're living in
You're not-
Melville
you're
and
not ruining the roads.
you got to commute, fair enough. But the impact of increasing the gas tax would, in my view, disproportionately affect the middle class. Now, I do have, and some of us have talked about this, what I believe is an elegant and pragmatic and bipartisan solution to this whole thing, which I've negotiated with the CEOs of Honeywell and Caterpillar, not exactly necessarily reflexive lovers of Democrats, and I've talked to unions about this, and I'm proposing it and pushing it. And won't bore you to tears, but bottom line is this. We've got $2 trillion in corporate assets parked overseas because corporations don't want to repatriate them at what they say is a confiscatory 37.5% tax rate. So they're just leaving that parked. What I say is, we will let you bring back those assets. You can repatriate those assets, technically at a 15% rate, but we'll do you one better. We'll let you bring it back at 4%, which is what the corporate community advocates. They want a 4% rate to bring it back. And the deal is that everything you bring back between 4 and 15%, you use to invest in a Rebuild America bond. That will earn you money. So not only do you get the lower tax rate, you get interest on your bond, and you can sell the bond after a year. Your assets aren't captive in the bond. That is going to create hundreds of billions of dollars of revenues that would go into infrastructure in this country. We have an infrastructure that's falling apart, 153,000 bridges, 70,000 miles of federal roadway. Whenever I fly to LaGuardia, from LaGuardia down to DC, and if you win, you'll have this experience. 9 times out of 10, you get in that seat, and the pilot says, folks, we're number 15 or 20 or a 25th for takeoff because we have an antiquated commercial aviation system. We're behind China, we're behind Asia, we're falling further and further behind. $2 trillion parked overseas that we can repatriate to fund infrastructure. And you know what our total infrastructure deficiency is in this country? $2 trillion.
Okay,
It's
Okay, you had
pragmatism.
that idea
But-
for a while. Where is it?
So we're still working on it. So unlike, some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, who have an idea and rush to a press release and then find out why the idea is not a good one, I have been working behind the scenes on this now for a year and a half with all of the stakeholders. We have had to negotiate some issues. I want to get this ready so that it is bulletproof when it's introduced.
And what's the
So-
timeline?
I hope by the end of this year we'll have final agreement on the
And this is
language. We're very
bipartisan
close.
agreement, you're saying?
I've talked to several Republicans about co-sponsoring the bill. There are several of my colleagues who are engaged in this, but since it's not drafted yet, ready for introduction, I don't have any commitments yet on co-sponsors.
So, a couple questions about this, and I know before, but, so you point out it's a $2 trillion problem, and there's $2 trillion over in this. But in fact, what would be available in this bank would be 300 million, right? Or 300 billion. It would be the 15%. It's not the other
Correct.
85%.
Yes, I'm not
It's the
saying that all
15%.
$2 trillion is going to go to
So there's
infrastructure.
going to be 300 billion available in an infrastructure bank. But if we had the political will to borrow $300 billion, whether we borrow it from Honeywell or we borrow it from markets, we could go to the markets tomorrow. We could go get the whole $2 trillion tomorrow. So really, it's about, there's no shortage of money to be borrowed. There's a lack of political will to spend it on infrastructure. How does this how does this fix that?
Well, it fixes that by creating $300 billion in revenue from the repatriated assets.
But it's not revenue.
Yes, it is. It's revenue to the Treasury.
220 billion of it has to be paid back, just like anything we borrow.
Over the long term, yeah,
Yeah, but just like anything we
Right.
borrow over the long term.
right,
Okay.
right.
Look,
But just on that, I'm sorry. But what you're doing, by the way, is every $1 billion that you invest in infrastructure creates 55,000 jobs, returns $6 billion to the economy. So
Totally
you're
in
getting those
favor of fixing the
multiplier
infrastructure.
effects.
Let me just say, I favor fixing the infrastructure, but I think these gimmicks are a mistake. I think we should lower tax rates. If your proposal is to lower capital gains tax rate down to, or corporate tax rate down to 15%, which is what it sounded like you're advocating, or is it just a loophole?
On the repatriated assets.
Just for
On the
assets.
repatriated assets, correct.
To the extent they're profits.
You brought in the little LaGuardia anecdote, which, and talk about civil aviation. Is there anything you could do, as a congressman from New York, to get either next gen moving faster, or scrapped, or whatever? But this is just the biggest boondoggle I've seen, and we're suffering from the flight noise, from the delays, and it's hurting our economy and our quality of life here. What would you do to deal with the FAA and get this thing going? I don't know.
To get what going in particular?
It's this new system called Next Gen that's been, next generation for my grandchildren of speeding up flights in and out of major airports, and nothing has come of it. So maybe, Steve, you could
Sure,
start.
yeah. Well, I've been highly critical of the FAA because, for two reasons. Number one, here it is, the FAA, it's probably one of the most antiquated federal agencies that we have. And so it's not responsive, it's not agile. Next generation has become a debacle. It has become overly bureaucratized. On plane noise, the FAA has been insensitive and completely unresponsive to the concerns of local residents, particularly in Brookville and East Hills. So here's what we've done about it. Number one, I was able to, for the first time ever, bringing all the stakeholders together, do for LaGuardia and JFK what every other major airport has, and that is community roundtables. So you have stakeholders, and it's not just a bunch of people talking to one another. There has been progress in plane noise in many metropolitan areas because there's a structure of mayors and community leaders and environmentalists and the aviation industry and passengers that get into a room and begin to debate and discuss some of the environmental impacts. That's number one. Never had that before. We now have it through the Port Authority and the FAA. Number two, we have insufficient noise monitors. So I've been at so many of these meetings in Old Brookville, in East Hills, where somebody from the FAA will say, "There's no noise here. I don't know what you're talking about." And then a resident will say, "There's so much noise, and my ears are bleeding." And the other day, and a resident said this actually, "I looked up from my backyard and I could actually see the passenger in the lavatory out the window." And the FAA said, "Well, that's just silly. No, you didn't." And so I said, well, the noise is empirical, right? Noise is something you can measure. Why don't we have noise monitors? It turns out that most other major airports have a deployment of noise monitors, and they can quantify it. We didn't. The Port Authority has just agreed to my request as of 2 weeks ago to deploy additional noise monitors so we don't get into this, yes, it's noisy, no, it's not. And finally, I've created a Quiet Skies Caucus in Congress. 15 members who have the same issues we do that are pushing the FAA to be more responsive and to modernize. And one of the things we're pushing them specifically right now is there's a standard for decibel levels where it's now a 65 standard. So if the decibel level is 65 or higher, you're eligible for insulation in your schools and your businesses and your homes. But that 65 decibel level hasn't been adjusted for decades. And so we're proposing that the FAA adjust it from 65 to 55, just so more communities will be eligible for the kind of sound insulation that everybody else gets in America.
What about next gen though? What about modernizing,
Well,
takeoff and landing?
yeah, let me
Anything
answer that.
to be done with the
I mean,
FAA?
one thing I just wanted to add to that, which is, there are noise monitors around the New York airports, but they are far, far fewer than there are in comparable airports around the country. And I think both Steve and I spoke at a recent noise rally in Queens, and dealt with community leaders addressing that. And it's important, and it's important to hold the FAA's feet to the fire. And that's, again, it's something I would certainly not be afraid to do, and that's part of this job, is to hold that agency's feet to the fire. And look, we're here in the New York metropolitan area. Airport noise is far from a novel and emerging issue. In fact, has improved dramatically since the 1960s, and I remember as a kid, with jets, with the 1960s jet engines screaming overhead. So I agree that we ought to be lowering the decibel levels around the airports, but partly to reflect the improvement in technology and some of the quiet engine technology that has been enacted. But we can always do better. As far as next generation, as far as moving technology, absolutely. I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't have the most advanced technology in air traffic control here in the U.S. There's no excuse for us not to have it.
We're keeping it very late, but I just have to
Okay.
go on to one more topic, and that's climate change. And maybe you could speak to this in
Sure.
sense of urgency, what you feel should be done. Would you support a carbon tax? Just give us your views.
Yeah, no, I think Steve and I probably disagree on this issue broadly. Steve had supported enactment of a carbon tax. I don't. I think that I do believe that there is some climate change, but I also believe, and this is not a matter of belief, this is science. I went to Johns Hopkins University. I take science very seriously. There is a human impact on the climate, but it is far less than many of the alarmists proclaim. Sea level rise has been approximately 6 inches over the last 150 years. So yes, there is some sea level rise, but it's not, and it's been fairly linear, decade by decade, over that period. So I do believe we ought to be serious about protecting our environment. I do believe that we should all do our part to try to improve the global environment and protect the planet. But the reality is that most of this is no longer in our hands. China is has a far larger carbon imprint in the world now than we do. India soon will, and Brazil is closing in fast. So I mean, the reality is we are actually an increasingly smaller factor in carbon emissions in the world. It's also the science is not entirely clear on how the globe is processing these emissions. So I don't favor a carbon tax. I do believe strongly in scientific study. I think we need to look at this and monitor it and continue to monitor it. But I think it would be economically destructive to enact something like a Kyoto Protocol or a carbon tax, especially at this juncture when data points don't support the more alarmist scenarios.
Do you favor spending federal money to even further increase our defenses against rising?
I mean, look, I live here in Huntington. I mean, I live in Lloyd Neck. I drive 6 inches over the water sometimes. So I'm very conscious of sea level and what it can do. And I was there during Hurricane Sandy when we were cut off for a couple of days. So I've seen it. I do believe that it should be studied, and absolutely we should be increasing our defenses. I mean, it was very gratifying to see, for instance, Bayville, Long Island, I was there in 1992, and I saw the flood that came in, the nor'easter at the end of '92. It was very nice, very gratifying to see that in Hurricane Sandy, the improved defenses that had been put in, and that's a combination. It was a combination of the village of Bayville, the town of Oyster Bay, the county of Nassau, and the state and the federal government, but through a combination of initiatives, you know, raised
But you represent a
road
very
beds.
long coastline
Mhm.
if you were elected.
Yeah.
And most of the members don't have coastlines that
Mhm.
are in the majority in
Yeah.
House. So how would you persuade your fellow Republicans that this is a priority to be
Look, it is part, you know, it is part of the priorities. I mean, you're protecting this district. And, I mean, much of this district is not particularly low-lying. I mean, there are a few areas, Bayville is probably the most, you know, is the most obvious. But a lot of this district is not
well, the
particularly
entire
low-lying.
island? If you
South Shore is a very different story. I mean,
Yeah,
the
right.
South Shore communities are tremendously vulnerable. But there's no South Shore in this district, just.
No, I understand that, but it's still in the sense of the island and your colleagues as a whole.
Yeah,
and-
yeah.
and
And look, I you know, certainly want to see the South Shore protected as well. But that work's being done. I mean, right now, you know, through the post-Sandy recovery efforts, through New York Rising, through the conditions imposed on insurance payments, and renewal of insurance policies, I mean, you are seeing a lifting of you know, and they're substantial lifting of the foundations in a lot of houses, especially on the South Shore, all over Long Beach, all over the Rockaways. I was with Congressman Bob Turner the other day, who came out to support me, and you know, he was one of the houses that was burnt out. He was out in Breezy Point. He was one of those 150 homes that were burnt during Sandy. So, but he's back in, and his house is now, you know, 6 feet higher than it used to be, and foundations are a lot stronger. And I think those are the sort of policies that we should be supporting, and certainly federal aid should be there to do that, because, you know, in major national disasters, that's really a role the federal government has.
Steve, carbon tax?
Well, this is a major area of disagreement with us. I supported the American Climate and Energy Security Bill, which wasn't a carbon tax. It instills cap and trade, which we actually already have in this region. It's RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Initiative. Look, if you look at a satellite image of California right now, the actual color of the terrain of Central California has changed because of the rampant drought that they have there. Hurricane Sandy, if you talk to NOAA, they will tell you that the frequency of hurricanes battering Long Island is going to significantly increase. If you go to La Havre, and you talk about Bayville being the only area that's low-lying, go to La Havre in Queens, they almost lost their seawall as a result of Hurricane Sandy. If you talk to the Navy, they'll tell you that one of the biggest worries they have is in Norfolk, they're not going to be able to dock ships there because of the increase in the sea level. So they've got to figure out how they're going to dredge in order to get ships in to protect our national security. And if you talk to the intelligence community, they will tell you that the wars we're going to be fighting over the next several decades will be resource wars because of climate change: food, water, energy. And so I believe this is a massive threat that confronts our economy and our security. And there are 3 common sense things we can do about it. Number one, I've been advocating for major new investments in energy efficiency. Take a look at all the schools we have on Long Island. They look like factories because they were almost designed as factories to industrially produce kids. You know, drill them with math, science, English, get them out. The windows are just blowing tax dollars out because they're not insulated. We ought to give incentives to school districts to have newly insulated windows. That by itself would reduce our carbon footprint and stabilize climates. The second thing we can do is do research and development in new clean technologies. You know, John F. Kennedy went to Rice University in 1962, said by the end of the decade we'll land men on the moon. We've been having this debate over clean technologies now. That was 8 years. We've been doing this for 4 or 5 decades. And so we need to invest in clean technologies. And finally, this is again pragmatic. Congresswoman Eliana Ross-Layton, a Republican from Florida, and I have introduced a bill that would give Detroit incentives through their corporate average fuel economy standards to install a flex fuel chip, so that if you're driving a car and there are cheaper alternatives to gas, you can do it. You can pull into a gas station, you can switch to ethanol, you can switch to something else. Ultimately, you'll be able to switch to any number of alternatives to oil. People say, well, that's impossible, can't do it. They do it in Brazil.
Brazil, yeah.
They do it in Brazil. So you're telling me they can do it in Brazil, but they can't do it in New York? I refuse to take that attitude.
All right, so you've introduced this bill?
Yes, it's been introduced. It was introduced last month by Eliana Russ-Layton, a Republican from Florida, and
What's been the
myself.
reception? Is it going anywhere?
Well, we introduced it just in time for Speaker Boehner to say, go home for the elections.
Okay. So is that a priority when you go back
It's
to
a
the next session?
very significant priority, absolutely. And it should pass because it's bipartisan and it provides an incentive to Detroit, not a mandate. And I have no problems with imposing mandates when it comes to our national security, but it incentivizes Detroit through pragmatism to install these flex fuel chips.
Grant, so you don't have bills that you've introduced already?
I have not introduced any bills.
What what would be the first bill that you would be proud to put your name on?
You know, there are a whole series of them. I'd like to see healthcare reforms put in. I'd like to see taxes reduced.
What are healthcare reforms?
Well, I'd like to see, and I don't think we're going to see Obamacare repealed during the remainder of the Obama presidency, but I'd certainly like to see a delay in the mandates, some of which the president has done on his own, some of which, with or without authority.
I think those bills are probably there with a lot of names on them already.
Of course.
What's the one that you want to be, the one that no one else has thought of that you're going to put your name on?
Well, again, I'd like to reduce. What I'd like to do is like to see tax rates reduced, and that I think is the most important thing.
For whom? How would you structure a tax rate reduction?
I'd reduce top end. I'd reduce marginal rates, and I'd reduce all rates. All brackets. But I'd like to see. What I'd like to see, and the ideal would be to reduce marginal tax rates down, something similar to what Reagan and Rostenkowski in a bipartisan Republican and Democrat bill put in 1986, certainly as far as the rates go, which was to have a 28% top federal rate and then a second rate that again was reduced from the Carter era and the early Reagan era rates.
What would that cost?
I don't know. I know there would be some revenue cost to it, but it would be dependent upon the total shape of the bill and how it deals with tax credits and deductions as well. So. There are many ways to skin a cat as far as ensuring that you have adequate revenues, but I think the high marginal rates are very destructive. And by the way, they encourage the sorts of gimmies and tax credit, political tax credits that we're seeing proliferate now.
So would you support getting rid of a lot of the most common gimmies and tax credits and
Well,
really flattening this thing out?
I would certainly love to see some of the corporate welfare tax credits. And I think you look at some of and Steve was talking about alternative energy proposals. Some of those have been the worst abuses.
What about for people?
Look,
Deductibility of mortgage, deductibility.
I strongly support mortgage deductibility. I believe that is built into our system, and I strongly support that.
State and local income tax?
I think, especially here in New York, of course, you have to keep that. So.
I know we'd love to keep going, but it's getting late. I know you
Thank
guys
you.
have
Great.
to wait.
Thank you very much.